Hey guys, I'm Ted. Welcome back to our lecture series. And for today's lecture, we're going to cover the trial of Dred Scott. Sorry, got a little out there for a moment. But for today's lecture, we're going to cover Dred Scott's trial. And of course, Dred Scott was perhaps the most famous slave in American history. He sued for his freedom. He filed what were known as freedom suits. Those are suits in which slaves file a lawsuit to get their freedom from their masters. And he took his all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, Dred Scott was not the first to do so, and he really wasn't the last to file a freedom suit in the United States. But his case really had such a major impact on the practice of slavery, on the use of freedom suits to obtain freedom, and the general breakdown of the sections in really what was one of the last three major episodes of sectional breakdowns before the disunion in 1860, in December of 1860. And to begin with, before we even begin our lecture proper, I'd just like to do our customary recap of our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed the breakdown of the second party system, how the Whigs proved to be unable to bear the burden of sectionalism anymore, and they splintered off. We also discussed the effect that sectionalism took on the Democrats. The Democrats, like the Whigs, splintered. The Democrats remained a party, but they were a strictly Southern party. They had very few supporters in the North, and mainly their supporters in the North were in the form of recent arrival immigrants who were not particularly well liked by the other Northern voters, Northern and Western voters. We saw how the Republican Party sort of grew from the shards of the broken parties that had broken under the strain of sectionalism in the 1850s. The Free Soilers, the Know Nothings, the Whigs, disaffected Northern Democrats, and generally those who wanted to oppose the Democrats. They all sort of just congregated into the Republican Party, who at first used the issue of slavery and containing slavery to attract voters, and used that as their main argument, containing slavery, as their main argument for the elections of 1856, sorry. And lastly, we looked at Bleeding Kansas, that very vitriolic situation in the Kansas Territory, in which a mini civil war was actually fought out. It was a very apt harbinger of things to come. In Kansas, we had the anti-slavery Kansans, who were really inching closer and closer to making Kansas a free territory and then a free state, and the Border Ruffians, that is, pro-slavery advocates from the state of Missouri, who came into the Kansas Territory and attempted to cow and intimidate the settlers into just allowing the pro-slavery Kansans to adopt a pro-slavery constitution for the territory and apply for admission as a slave state. And with that being said, I'd like to jump straight into our lecture today and pick up with the anarchy in Kansas. Because with the anarchy in Kansas and Congress falling into ever deeper and bitterer divisions, with Congress falling into ever deeper divisions and ever deeper divisions, the Supreme Court was drawn into the situation. The Supreme Court at this time was the last bastion of hope, of sanity, of non-partisan or sectional division in the Republic. So the recently elected president, James Buchanan, urged the Supreme Court to resolve the issue of slavery in as broad of terms as possible. And the case that the Supreme Court chose was the case of Scott v. Sanford. And that case involved the slave named Dred Scott. And just to caption on this on his name for a minute, we do not know if Dred was his actual name, and there's very strong evidence that Dred is not his name. It was not his name, but Dred was simply the name given by his by his master who owned him the longest, and that the name simply stuck. It was simply the name that he was referred to, but not his birth name. But in any regards, Dred Scott is the name that he is remembered by. It is the name that he is memorialized by. And anyway, Dred Scott. Dred was a slave. He filed his suit with the aid of abolitionists. He launched that suit for freedom. And freedom suits, as I noted, were nothing new. They had been occurring since colonial times. And Scott's lawyers argued that his master, John Emerson, had taken him to the free state of Illinois, and that that the free state of Illinois and the free state or free territory at that point of Wisconsin, while being taken there, those two areas did not recognize slavery as a legal condition, and therefore Scott was a freed person by his long habitation in those states. They used an old doctrine known as once free, always free, to argue that case, that because Scott had entered free state and free territory where slavery was not recognized under local law, he was free. Now, Scott was taken there because Emerson worked as a surgeon for the United States Army, and Scott's heir and widow, Eliza Sanford, disputed the assertion that Scott was legally free, and the case was filed at a local court, a local level court in Missouri. And originally, the case was decided in Scott's favor by a Missouri jury in 1850. But Eliza Sanford, she appealed that decision, and she filed that appeal with the Missouri State Supreme Court. And in 1858, she won her appeal, and the lower court's ruling was overturned. Now, Scott was not deterred by this. In 1853, Scott sued again. He filed suit again, this time in federal court. Now, by 1853, Irene Sanford Emerson had relocated to the Northeast and left Dred Scott in the possession of her brother, John Sanford. Now, the federal district court upheld the ruling of the Missouri Supreme Court. So Scott, at this point, he filed an appeal with the Supreme Court. And just as a little caption on all of this, while Scott was filing his appeals, he was taken out of the custody of the Sanford family, and he was held in the jail of the city of St. Louis. He was held in St. Louis City Jail, and he was rented out to perform tasks and duties, and all of the earnings that he made was kept in a savings for whoever won the case. If Scott won the case, he'd undoubtedly be given a portion of the earnings, and if the Sanford family kept winning the cases, then they would be given the entirety of the earnings. And now the Supreme Court, in one of their most controversial decisions in that court's history, ruled against Scott in March of 1856, and Chief Justice Roger Taney, Andrew Jackson's old lieutenant in the Bank War, Chief Justice Roger Taney, in his opinion, stated that Scott was a slave, no matter where he lived, and that as a slave, he did not have the right to bring suit in a court of law. Taney really elaborated in his opinion on the case. He went on to state that neither Dred Scott or any other person, anyone else of African descent, was eligible for American citizenship or the guarantees of the federal constitution or any state or territorial constitution. The broad rulings in the Dred Scott case, the very broad ruling in the Dred Scott case included the strike down of the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. Now, the Missouri Compromise had kept the issue of slavery relatively contained in the old Louisiana Purchase country. And again, the old Louisiana Purchase country pertained to Kansas and Nebraska and the territory of Minnesota. That was, right on the verge of becoming the state of Minnesota around the time in 1856, 1857. The ruling, the strike down on the strike down on the Missouri Compromise had far-reaching consequences. Many people in the Union and in the slave states and the free states saw the Missouri Compromise as legal, as binding, and has a definitive solution to the question of slavery in those territories. The strike down of the Missouri Compromise was entirely a sectional move designed to shore up support for slave owners, for the slavocrats in the federal Union. It was also a very a bold strike at states' rights, and this is something else that we will be looking at. It's a flip on the head of the traditional narrative that pro-slavery advocates were really just states' rights advocates, and that the free staters were for a strong centralized government. Then that wasn't the case. The slave advocates, the advocates of slavery, were all for a very strong and a very powerful central government. How long had that central government was working on their behalf for their benefit? Striking down the Missouri Compromise is a very detrimental to slave rights, to states' rights. But when states' rights interfere with your slave property, then you sort of have to move to adjust your aim and support the federal government. And further that, to further on with Taney's decision, Taney went on to elaborate that Congress had no right to tell citizens what to do with their property, that property being slaves. And as I stated earlier, a little bit earlier, to white Americans in the free states, the ruling meant that a slave owner could bring his slaves into any free state or territory, making the entire federal union, the entire United States, slaves territory. And again, it echoed to these people, these white Americans in the free states and free territories. It echoed calls of a slave power conspiracy that was determined to force itself on the entire republic. Now, to pro-slavery advocates, the ruling was great for them, but at all times they were preoccupied with their own fears. They were constantly on guard against potential slave uprisings. They were also really worried about the fact that they were being outdistanced by the free states in the North, the Midwest, and the Pacific Coast West. The free states and territories there were growing increasingly wealthier, industrialized, and growing population-wise, increasing dramatically population-wise. But they were nonetheless pleased with the court's rulings. And again, another flip on the head for the states' rights advocacy of the pro-slavery faction of the nation. The slavocrats and citizens from the slave states in general were frequently echoing that, or were known to frequently echo that, if the free states and those living in the free states and territories did not accept the decision of the court, it would show that they were not good law-abiding citizens, that they did not hold the best for the Union and held in their hearts or in high regard. A lot of the northern Democrats, the dough faces, a lot of them opposed the Dred Scott decision, most notably Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas, the famed senator from Illinois. But Douglas opposed the Dred Scott decision primarily on the grounds that it denied the people living in the territories. The right to exercise popular sovereignty on whether or not to allow slavery where they lived. With the Dred, and really one of the main impacts of the Dred Scott decision was that the Supreme Court, that many people look to, had the last bastion of untaintedness in the Union. The Supreme Court was now tainted by the issue of slavery. The Supreme Court would now join the presidency, political parties, and Congress are being mired and palsied by the issue of slavery. Now, on the international scene, there was a lot of activity going on the international scene that really sort of stoked the fears of the slavocrats in the United States. Most notably, Great Britain and France abolished slavery in their empires in 1833 and 1848 respectively. And the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin that was published earlier in the early 1850s, around 1852, that novel was still going strong in the nation, and the Dred Scott decision has sort of given it a second win. It didn't really need a second win, but the Dred Scott decision sort of gave it a second win, and more people began to buy the novel and to read it to discover more on the horrors of slavery. The Dred Scott decision did more to turn lukewarm Northerners against slavery than anything else. And again, the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin presented the evils of slavery with a melodramatic flair to audiences that had been lukewarm or sort of indifferent to the issue of slavery. Now, the Dred Scott case does have a bittersweet ending. During his freedom suits, his legally recognized owner, Irene Stanford Emerson, had remarried, and she remarried to the prominent Massachusetts abolitionist and congressman Calvin Chaffee. Now, Chaffee was a very prominent, he was an extremely prominent abolitionist, known for fiery rhetoric and known for outright denunciations of the practice of slaveholding. Chaffee was attacked savagely for his hypocrisy, and he was attacked by fellow abolitionists and other slave owners for condemning slavery, while his wife benefited from the labor and from the labors of the Republic's most infamous slave. Now, after the Supreme Court ruling, Scott was deeded to the family of his original owner, who had funded his early suits, and he was manumitted by them in 1857. And this is where the sweet turns to bitter. Dred Scott's freedom was short-lived. He died less than a year later in 1858. The illness isn't quite known, but it was sudden, and he didn't really get a chance to enjoy the full taste of freedom. The Dred Scott case, ended the notion of federal prohibition on the expansion of slavery or regulation of slavery anywhere, and it was envisioned by its supporters to be the begin all end all of federal regulation, or attempts by anti-slavery forces to regulate slavery. Now with Dred Scott covered, I'd like to just touch on one of the after effects of Dred Scott, and that would be the EastWest Alliance, as it's known. In the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision, a group of economic leaders in the free states and territories began to envision a future in which the slave states played a secondary or minor role in the republic's economy. Many began laying the foundation of a Atlantic seaboard, Great Lakes, Great Plains, Pacific Ocean Economic Alliance to combat the slave states' overwhelming influence on the nation's economy, on the early republic's economy. And now to give you a sort of insight into the overwhelming influence that the slave states had on the nation's economy, cotton, the agricultural product cotton, gave the early republic a favorable balance of trade alone. That is, when you added up everything that the United States imported in 1 year and 365 days, all of the imports, all of the money they spent on the imports was less than the money received for exporting cotton. Cotton by itself, cotton alone, made the United States wealthy. And when you add in the other products like grain or wheat, fruits, tobacco, sugar, indigo, rice, when you add in all the other agricultural products that the South produced, it gave the United States a very, very good balance of trade. It made the United States a wealthy nation. But these group of men, they sought to develop the United States. They sought to put the federal dollars to work to sort of combat, to openly combat, not sort of, but to openly combat the South's dominance in national economy. This is why you had dough-faced men. Everyone knew where the money was at. Obviously, if you're not paying your labor force, you retain a greater percentage of the profits. But these men got together to overcome the influence of the slave states in the republic's economy. Now the plan was really hinged on making land even more readily available to settlers, with immigration rates at an all-time high. In the 1850s, immigration rates in the United States was at an all-time high. This is in the aftermath of the revolutions of 1848 in Europe. So you have massive amounts of people simply fleeing Europe, jumping on their ships, particularly in Germany, around North and Central Europe. We had a lot of people from that area simply picking up and leaving. You had all those guys picking up and leaving, so immigration rates were at an all-time high in the 1850s. Manufacturers could afford to let their workers drift westward, something they had consistently opposed in the 1830s and 1840s. They had consistently opposed that, but they were more willing to do that because they could always find new laborers. And for those who drifted westward, they were given the opportunity to settle down on easily attained land, and given all the tools and opportunity to produce the raw goods needed for the eastern factories. And in return, these settlers became the consumers of the finished products that those manufacturers and those factories produced. Now, the Republican Party, that newly founded Republican Party, jumped on this. They came up with a very innovative platform that included a Homestead Act to make Western land more available, government funding for agricultural and mechanical colleges to properly educate workers and farmers, an increase in overall government spending for internal improvements such as railroads, strong protective tariffs, and really this platform was very similar to what Alexander Hamilton had advocated back in the 1790s, or what Henry Clay had began to advocate back in the 1820s. This gave the Republican Party a broad base to appeal to other free state and free territory voters other than the issue of abolition and slavery. It also was designed to catapult, and this is something people don't really realize about this, but in 1850, there were a group of influential men, wealthy influential men, who were already beginning to design out the future of America, to design out what it would take to make the United States a major global competitor, a major global economic competitor. And this plan was designed to catapult the United States into a position of global economic leadership. And among the people who supported this, and there weren't many who did, particularly in the South or even in the North amongst the doughfaces, there weren't many who did. But one of the men who supported this view of the United States and the future of the United States was Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln entered the national consciousness at around this time. And we will get to Abraham Lincoln in our next lecture. And that'll wrap it up for our lecture for today. I want to thank you guys for listening, for watching. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you guys thought about this lecture. And as always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys for another lecture.